France's President Emmanuel Macron has again floated the idea of deepening the country's relationship with the war, including the potential of incorporating, actually sending ground troops to support Ukraine. All this is adding to uncertainty and severe concerns over escalation. In this video, I'll be breaking down exactly what was said, how Europe is receiving it, what Russia thought of it, and what could happen next.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everybody. My name is Piotr, and so we're going to be talking about the seismic shift within NATO regarding the conflict in Ukraine. As always, keep in mind that this video isn't going to be reflective of every single factor. It is only a few minutes long, but the idea is to bring you up to speed with the various elements to this complex update and to come away having some greater clarity around it, hopefully. So what has Macron actually said? He essentially suggested that there might be a need for more Western troops to actually be present within the country. This surprised quite a few other fellow European nations when he suggested it during the newly formed European Union-Ukraine summit in Paris, and immediately put him at odds with several other entities and leaders. His foreign secretary, Rejection, said that troops, though, could be sent to Ukraine on a, quote, training mission or to build weapons without breaching a belligerency threshold. Now, such assertive language and suggestions by Macron put him very much at odds with a large proportion of NATO, including even President Joe Biden, who was apparently pretty wary of what was said. Other countries in Europe, such as the British, Germans, Polish and Italians, have also echoed similar sentiments that any idea of sending large-scale troop deployments is absolutely out of the question, or for right now, not something that they are considering, including the British Defence Ministry that said beyond, quote, the small number of personnel in country supporting the armed forces, we do not have any plans to make large-scale deployments. These widespread rejections increasingly illustrate the deepening divisions that exist within the NATO alliance. We should keep in mind that the NATO alliance as a collective has promised to do everything it can to support the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. But there are divisions and divergences over what the intricate details, the how, that should be done so as to support Ukraine. Whilst the end goal is the same, variations on how to get there are different. The cautiousness of this approach is something that has generally been the predominant narrative within the NATO alliance, as it seeks to avoid full-scale conflict with Russia, direct confrontation, ultimately because that would lead to a likely nuclear exchange with the Kremlin. Macron emphasized that his thoughts were carefully considered, and there are variations of people that have interpreted this as a signal that he wants to directly engage the Russians, whilst others are emphasizing it's more nuanced than that, and that there are variations to how you could increase support for the country. That said, one US official was actually quoted as saying that after the dinner that came at the summit, that there wouldn't necessarily be anything that came out of it that was positive. Macron's comments also signify the continued slight French deviation away from the alliance, and that historically France has always had a slightly different approach to how it sees itself in the continent, but also how it engages in security affairs. Germany firmly rejected Macron's proposals, noting the potential of a coalition for missile and bomb support, but with ultimately the German Deputy Chancellor, Robert Habeck, saying that whilst he was pleased France was thinking of how to increase its support for Ukraine, he would, quote, give it a word of advice, supply more weapons. Germany's rejection again illustrates the very, very embedded divisions within the country itself, as well as between the two main members of the European Union, but is also reflective of how France has generally been on this position, but is also reflective of the steady and quite slow approach Germany has had towards the war, dragging its feet in many people's opinion, since Olaf Scholz took over, and an unwillingness to really provide Ukraine with offensive military humanitarian supplies, focusing on, say, defensive in the first few months of the war. That said, Macron has persisted, emphasizing the potential of, say, mine clearance capabilities, cyber support, and local weapons production for Ukraine. Indeed, Ukraine's main emphasis for 2024 is to maximize its in-house, its domestic production of munitions and other pieces of equipment for its war campaign that it feels it is lacking from the support of Western nations. Germany has suggested that France should focus more on these elements than, say, simply sending ground troops, because that would be a significant escalation. This multifaceted approach by Macron, that said, is something that I think has gotten lost in the noise. There is a lot of people who think that because Macron has suggested the idea of producing troops into the country, that means onto the front lines, when there are many other roles that troop members can have. Interestingly enough, Lithuania has emerged as a very, very vocal but quite lone supporter of France, expressing its willingness to discuss the idea of sending troops, with Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, head of Britain's armed forces, also assuring that overall response from NATO is there, but that when it comes to the nuances, we need to consider those elements a little bit more. Lithuania's support, for me, shows you the clear division lines within NATO. For example, the Baltic states and Britain have been much more hawkish, much more assertive in their positioning towards wanting to support Ukraine and ensuring an outright victory, versus more parts of continental Europe, which are dovish, a little bit more cautious, reluctant to do such things. France has vacillated between this, and Macron himself has always emphasized the importance of a European security, but it's not clear exactly whether France's shift is going to galvanize other countries to do such. The fact that the leader of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, being very vocally critical as she has been, despite her very vocal criticisms of Putin and desire for Ukraine to be a sovereign state, shows you the red lines and limitations that different nation states have, and why, in my opinion, the idea of referring to the West is increasingly not necessarily that useful, because whilst the West is, largely speaking, united on certain values, it's not a monolith. And there are a lot of variations about highly complex, sensitive, and worldly issues. While Germany and Poland, even though Poland, under the new leadership of Donald Tusk, the former European president, has also said they will absolutely not encourage troops, the Kremlin has warned that any direct conflict between NATO and Russia would inevitably involve combat troops that were deployed. Since then, Macron has tried to clarify his comments, but this has not been enough to dissuade the Kremlin, and Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, saying that in any case, quote, we would not need to talk not about the probability, but about the inevitability, end quote, of such a conflict. This warning emphasizes that Russia sees the stakes involved as well, and continues potentially about the threat of nuclear engagement between the two sides. Now, when it comes to Macron's comments, there are some inconsistencies here, in that whilst Ukraine is one of the biggest issues for Macron, and his continued resounding support for it through words is not consistently shown through action. France continues to not meet its 2% NATO target, and ultimately that undermines its ability to say that it really has the interest of Ukraine and European security and defense in mind, because if you do not meet the spending targets of the NATO alliance, then ultimately can you really say that you stand by those words that you have expressed? So in this part, I'm going to add a little bit more of an opinion. There are a few elements here that I think are at play as well when it comes to Macron and France and NATO. Firstly, Macron is a known vocalist relative to others about European foreign policy, and I think he sees himself as a bit of a visionary, someone who wants to be seen as a leader in the redefining of Europe the European Union in this multipolar, very unpredictable world that we're currently living in. His visit last year to China was heavily criticized by the United States, but welcomed by President Xi of China, because even expressing the idea that a third pole could be open in the two poles of the strategical competition between the United States and China, for example. Macron himself, keep in mind that the leadership is also as an individual versus the country. Macron is quite egotistical. He likes to frame things from a way of what his legacy will be, where he fits into all of this. Cast your minds back to when the full-scale war began, and in the first few months, and even to the build-up to February 24th, Macron was extremely active, going to Russia, engaging Putin, only for him to be snubbed, and leading to Macron being made to look very humiliated on the international stage. This is something that he hasn't forgotten and has sought to rekindle through some of the very, very staunch speeches and remarks he's given since February 24th. Also, keep in mind that strong rhetoric doesn't necessarily mean kinetic action. He's not feeling great about his personal reputation, as I mentioned just before, nor with what's been happening in Africa. France is on the back foot. It has largely lost its foothold in its former colonial areas of Western Africa and the Sahel, and who has been welcomed in to replace that, or been welcomed by some of the leadership that has since taken over? Russia, the Wagner Group. So this is something that ultimately is also potentially playing at the back of Macron's head. France has always been, as I mentioned earlier on, a little bit more independent, a little bit more autonomous in the way it conducts its foreign policy vis-a-vis NATO or transatlantic relations, versus, say, the UK, which tends to align its foreign policy on certain issues with the Americans much more. De Gaulle did this when he left the military command structure in the 1960s. And also, even in the UN, we can see it today, where France is not afraid to criticize the Americans or Israel or in the Middle East, versus the UK, for example, which tends to abstain. Additionally, Macron is wary of what comes after him. Right now, there is a lot of talk within France about a successor to Macron. He cannot run again, but there is no clear person that will follow on from him. And that leaves not many people who currently can go up against one of the biggest concerns for many French people, which is the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen, who has been performing increasingly successful in subsequent elections in the past few years. If he pursues some form of troops into Ukraine, that could compromise his position, mainly because it would pull France into a situation where the economy is already suffering, and maybe something that the French electorate is not very keen on. Now, of course, this isn't meant to be encompassing all the factors, but it does, I think, illustrate a little bit where Macron is coming from and what he's seeking to do. Now, keeping aside some of those possibilities, those possible factors behind Macron's comments and the degree of conjecture, what is clear is that there is a difference here in timing. Some of Macron's proposals are, from a strategical sense, potentially useful, but they don't necessarily help Ukraine now, and particularly at a tactical level. So the Ukrainians keep reminding Western capitals what they need most is munitions and a consistent supply in military funding. If France is keen to lead on European security, that is one thing, but the idea of trial ballooning, so to speak, the idea of bringing more groups on the ground and other methods should be perhaps done in a less obvious sense, a less public sense, and they should focus on the idea of supporting existing systems as they are, such as the Ukrainian Defense Contact Group and other methods by which the French can send and supply weapons and material. Ultimately, the Kremlin and Putin will welcome the growing disruption between Western capitals, and that when someone who proposes ideas with a good intention actually causes greater division and distraction, that ultimately enables him to accelerate his own campaign to achieve his war aims. All of this moves very quickly, and it's not something that we can ever fully get our heads around, but we aim to do that on here. As always, if you enjoy these conversations, if you enjoy my content, then consider leaving a like and subscription, put the bell notification on, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. And remember that life is a game of gambits, so make every move a masterstroke. I've been Piotr. This is the Global Gambit. Until next time.